If you had asked me a year ago, I would have said my marriage was steady, solid even. Claire and I had been together for 10 years, and while the early days of passion and excitement had given way to routine, I thought we were content. We had a nice home in the suburbs, 2 cats that acted like they owned the place, and careers that kept us both busy but fulfilled. I'm Matthew, 36, a financial analyst. Numbers are my world, a predictable, logical escape from life's uncertainties. Claire, 34, is a freelance writer, a career she pursued with passion and creativity. Her work ranged from personal essays to ghostwriting novels, and while she often kept the specifics of her projects to herself, I admired her dedication. Our dynamic worked, or at least, it seemed to. I brought structure and stability, while she brought spontaneity and warmth. Over the years, we'd faced the usual ups and downs, arguments over money, stressful work weeks, and the occasional miscommunication. But nothing had ever shaken my faith in us. That was until a few months ago when I started noticing subtle changes. Claire seemed distant. She'd always been the type to get lost in her work, but now, it felt like more than that. She spent hours holed up in her office, late into the night, tapping away at her laptop or scribbling furiously in her journal. At first, I chalked it up to a big project. Deadlines could make her intense, and she thrived under pressure. But as the weeks turned into months, the distance between us grew. Conversations that once flowed easily became stilted, as if she was holding something back. Just busy with work, she'd say when I asked. You know how it is. I did know how it was, or at least, I thought I did. But there was something different about the way she said it, a flicker of nervousness in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. One night, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, I watched her jotting something down in her journal. She was always protective of it, never leaving it out in the open. I respected her privacy, of course, but I couldn't help but wonder what thoughts filled its pages. Looking back, that moment was a turning point, though I didn't realize it at the time. That journal held secrets that would upend everything I thought I knew about my marriage. And when I finally discovered the truth, it left me questioning not just Claire, but myself, and the life we had built together. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It wasn't a single event that unraveled us, it was a series of small, almost imperceptible moments that added up to something I couldn't ignore. Moments that, at the time, seemed insignificant, but in hindsight, were like cracks forming in the foundation of our relationship. I never imagined my world would come crashing down because of a secret diary. But sometimes, the things we least expect are the ones that change everything. It started small. Little things that, at first, seemed easy to dismiss. Claire had always been a bit of a night owl, often working late into the evening when inspiration struck. But lately, those late nights had become more frequent, and when I'd wander into her office to check on her, she'd close her laptop or cover her journal the moment she saw me. "What are you working on?" I'd ask, leaning against the doorframe. "Just a project," she'd reply, her tone light but her movements almost too deliberate, as if she were trying to act casual. That protective attitude toward her journal was new. In the past, she'd sometimes share snippets of what she was writing or ask for my opinion. Now, it felt like her work had become a barrier between us. She carried the journal with her everywhere, even taking it into the bathroom or keeping it tucked away in her bag when she wasn't writing in it. I told myself it was nothing, just her being extra careful about a sensitive project or maybe trying out a new, deeply personal writing style. Writers are quirky, I reasoned. And Claire had always been a little private when she was deeply immersed in something. But the distance didn't stop with her work habits. She started pulling away in other ways, too. Our evenings together, once spent talking about our days or watching TV, were now filled with silence. She seemed preoccupied, lost in thought even when she was sitting right next to me. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. "I'm just tired," she said one evening, stifling a yawn that didn't quite seem genuine. Are you sure? I pressed, not wanting to come across as pushy but unable to ignore the growing unease in my gut. Yeah, it's just this deadline. Once it's done, I'll feel better. Promise. Her words were reassuring enough in the moment, but the pattern continued. Late nights. Distracted conversations. A noticeable drop in intimacy. And always, that journal, clutched tightly to her chest, as if it held the key to her very being. One weekend, I suggested we spend the day together, hoping to bridge the gap. Let's go to the farmer's market or take a walk in the park, I said. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward her office. I wish I could, but I have so much work to do. Rain check. I nodded, forcing a smile, but her response stung. It wasn't just that she was busy, it was the sense that she didn't want to make time for me. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the TV playing to an empty audience, I started to feel a nagging sense of doubt. Was this just a rough patch, or was there something deeper going on? The tipping point came a few days later. I had the day off and decided to tackle some much-needed cleaning around the house. As I sorted through a pile of mail on the dining table, I noticed Claire's journal sitting nearby. She must have left it there before rushing off to run an errand. It was the first time I'd seen it unattended in months. For a moment, I froze, torn between respecting her privacy and the growing suspicion that something wasn't right. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no reason to snoop. But as I stared at the journal, an unsettling thought crept into my mind: what if the answers to all my questions were right there, just waiting to be uncovered? My hand hovered over the cover, my heart pounding. In the end, I decided to leave it alone. Not yet, I thought. I wasn't ready to cross that line. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it was only a matter of time before I found myself back at that moment, unable to resist the urge to know the truth. A few weeks later, Claire left early one morning to meet a client downtown. She'd forgotten her journal on the nightstand, something I immediately noticed as I walked past our bedroom. For a moment, I froze in the hallway, my eyes drawn to it like a beacon. It sat there, innocuous but heavy with the weight of the unknown. I could almost hear her voice in my head: "You wouldn't understand, it's just work." Except this wasn't just work. I could feel it in my gut. I paced back and forth, my rational side battling with my growing suspicion. I'd always believed in respecting her privacy, trusting that if something was wrong, she'd tell me. But these past few months had chipped away at that trust, leaving me raw with doubt. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped into the bedroom and picked up the journal. My hands trembled as I held it, the leather cover warm from the morning sun streaming through the window. Just one page, I whispered to myself, trying to justify what I was about to do. If it's nothing, I'll put it back. I flipped it open, my breath catching as I scanned the familiar, looping handwriting. The first few pages were filled with typical musings, random thoughts, ideas for stories, even a grocery list. For a brief moment, I felt a wave of relief. Maybe I really was overreacting. But then, a particular entry caught my eye. Met him again today. I told myself I wouldn't, but I couldn't resist. There's something about the way he listens, the way he makes me feel seen. I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. My stomach twisted as I read the words. I flipped to the next page, then the next, unable to stop myself. The entries became more explicit, detailing moments with him, a man she referred to only as Jay. She described their conversations, their laughter, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. It wasn't just physical, though there were hints of that, too. It was emotional, a connection she'd been nurturing behind my back while I sat at home, clueless. As I read on, the timeline began to piece itself together. Meetings that I thought were work-related, nights when she'd come home exhausted, even the weekends she claimed she needed to focus on a project, all of it aligned with her secret life. My mind raced, the words on the pages blurring together as my emotions boiled over. Betrayal, anger, humiliation, it all hit me at once. How could she do this? How long had I been living in this lie, thinking we were just going through a rough patch? By the time I closed the journal, my hands were trembling so hard I nearly dropped it. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the cover, my thoughts a whirlwind. This wasn't the Claire I knew. Or maybe, I realized with a sinking feeling, I didn't know her at all. I wanted to storm out, to call her right then and demand answers. But as the anger burned through me, it left behind something colder and heavier, heartbreak. I placed the journal back where I'd found it, careful to leave no sign that it had been touched. But as I walked out of the room, I knew there was no going back. The truth was out, and it had shattered the foundation of everything I thought we had. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on anything, not work, not food, not even the mindless scrolling on my phone that usually helped me pass the time. Every thought, every memory of Claire, was tainted now. I kept replaying the words I'd read in her journal, each sentence digging deeper into my chest. He makes me feel seen. The phrase kept echoing in my mind, mocking me. Hadn't I seen her? Hadn't I supported her dreams, celebrated her successes, and stood by her through everything? Apparently, it wasn't enough. I sat in the living room, staring blankly at the muted television, the journal's revelations swirling in my mind. My emotions cycled between rage and despair, my stomach knotting with every painful realization. This wasn't some abstract story you'd hear about someone else. This was my wife. My marriage. My life. I kept trying to rationalize what I'd read, to make sense of it. Maybe it was all in her head, a fantasy she used for inspiration in her writing. She was a creative person, after all. But the timeline was too precise, the details too vivid to dismiss. The words weren't fictional. They were real. By the time Claire returned home that evening, I'd worked myself into a state of quiet fury. I watched her walk through the door, casual and smiling, like nothing had changed. She dropped her bag on the counter, the same bag where she probably carried that journal when it wasn't on the nightstand. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her voice light and unconcerned. I mumbled a vague response, not trusting myself to speak more than a few words. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand answers and force her to acknowledge what she'd done. But another part of me hesitated. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to say. Claire didn't seem to notice my mood, or maybe she did and chose to ignore it. She disappeared into her office after dinner, leaving me alone with my thoughts. That night, I lay in bed while she worked late, her desk lamp casting a faint glow under the door. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How long had this been going on? Did she love him? Did she still love me? I thought about the life we'd built together, the trips we'd taken, the nights spent laughing over wine, the plans we'd made for the future. Was all of it a lie? Sleep didn't come easily that night. When Claire finally climbed into bed, she kissed me on the cheek, her lips soft and familiar. For a moment, I almost forgot. But the memory of that journal came rushing back, a cold reminder of the secrets she was keeping. I rolled onto my side, away from her, and closed my eyes. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I'd confront her. And no matter what she said, there was no escaping the fact that everything had changed. The next morning, I woke up before Claire, my stomach twisted in knots. She was still asleep, her face peaceful in a way that felt almost offensive given the storm raging inside me. I got up quietly and paced the living room, trying to figure out how to approach her. Every scenario that played out in my head felt inadequate. By the time Claire came out of the bedroom, dressed in her usual cozy sweater and leggings, I had barely touched the coffee I'd made. She smiled at me as she grabbed a mug from the cabinet, the same easy smile that used to make me feel warm inside. Now, it just made me feel sick. "Morning," she said brightly, pouring herself some coffee. "Claire, we need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She turned to me, her smile faltering. "Okay, what's going on?" I gestured for her to sit down at the kitchen table. She hesitated but complied, her brow furrowing as she studied my face. "I found your journal," I said, getting straight to the point. Her eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she quickly masked it. You read it?" "Yes," I said, my voice low but steady. "I read it. And I know." For a moment, she just stared at me, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Matthew, I can explain," she started, but I cut her off. "Explain what, Claire?" "That you've been sneaking around behind my back. That you've been meeting him, writing about him, building a secret life I had no idea about." "What exactly is there to explain?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't soften me. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear, it got out of control. I wasn't thinking." "No," I interrupted, my anger boiling over. "You were thinking. You were thinking every time you wrote about him, every time you chose to keep this from me. Don't pretend this was some accident, Claire. You made a choice." She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she began to cry. "I was lonely," she said through her sobs. "You've been so busy with work, and I felt like we weren't connecting anymore. He was just someone who listened, who made me feel." "Don't," I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. "Don't try to justify this by blaming me. If you were unhappy, you could have talked to me. You could have told me how you felt. Instead, you chose to betray me." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. The anger and hurt were too raw, too overwhelming. After a few minutes, she looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I'm so sorry, Matthew," she whispered. "I love you. I never stopped loving you. I don't know why I did this, but I'll do whatever it takes to fix it. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." Her words hung in the air, heavy and desperate. Part of me wanted to believe her, to cling to the hope that our marriage could survive this. But another part of me, the part that had read every damning word in her journal, wasn't so sure. "I don't know if I can," I said finally, my voice breaking. "I don't even know where to start." She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "We can start with the truth," she said softly. "I'll tell you everything, no more hiding. I'll go to therapy, I'll cut off all contact with him, whatever you need. Just please, don't give up on us." I stared at her hand, inches from mine, and felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Hope? Grief? Maybe both. "I need time," I said, pulling my hand back. "I can't decide anything right now." She nodded, her tears falling silently. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes." The conversation left me drained, the weight of her words and my own emotions pressing down on me. Forgiveness felt impossible, but so did the thought of walking away from everything we'd built. As I sat alone in the living room that evening, I realized that this wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about the cracks in our relationship that had led us here, cracks we'd both ignored for far too long. The question now was whether we could find a way to mend them, or if we'd already reached the breaking point. The days following our confrontation felt like walking through a fog. I'd expected some kind of clarity after finally addressing the truth, but instead, I was left with more questions than answers. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it was joined by something heavier, a profound sense of loss. Claire, to her credit, was trying. She gave me space, staying out of my way unless I approached her. When we did talk, she was careful with her words, answering my questions honestly without pushing too hard. She deleted all traces of Jay from her life, messages, photos, even contact information. She made it clear she was willing to do whatever it took to repair the damage, but I wasn't sure it was enough. I spent most of my time outside the house, finding excuses to avoid her. Work became my refuge, a place where everything made sense. Numbers didn't betray you. They didn't leave you questioning your worth or wondering what you could have done differently. In the evenings, I'd sit in the car for long stretches before going inside, dreading the inevitable tension. Some nights, I didn't even make it to the living room. I'd head straight to the spare room, close the door, and let the silence envelop me. One night, as I sat alone in the spare room, Claire knocked softly on the door. "Matthew," she said, her voice hesitant. "What is it?" I asked, not bothering to open the door. "Can we talk? Please." I sighed, running a hand through my hair before opening the door. She stood there, clutching a blanket around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn. "I made an appointment with a therapist," she said, her words rushing out. "For us. I know you're not ready to make any decisions yet, but I thought, maybe this could help." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Therapy felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the midst of the chaos, but it also felt like a reminder of how broken we'd become. "Okay," I said finally, my voice flat. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of hope. "Okay," she repeated softly. "Thank you." The first session was harder than I expected. The therapist, a calm, middle-aged woman named Dr. Hensley, welcomed us into her office and asked us to share why we were there. Claire went first, her voice trembling as she admitted to the affair. She talked about her feelings of loneliness, how she'd convinced herself that I was too busy with work to notice her. Her words stung, but I stayed quiet, letting her speak. When it was my turn, the anger bubbled to the surface. I laid it all out, the betrayal, the lies, the sense of humiliation. "She didn't just cheat on me," I said, my voice cracking. "She destroyed everything I thought we had." Dr. Hensley nodded, her expression compassionate but firm. "It's clear there's a lot of pain here," she said. "But it's also clear that you both want to find a way forward, even if you're not sure what that looks like yet." The session ended with no grand revelations, no sudden fixes. But it was a start. Over the next few weeks, we continued therapy. Each session forced us to confront the cracks in our relationship, cracks that had been there long before Claire's affair. I began to see that while her actions were inexcusable, the distance between us wasn't entirely her fault. Claire, for her part, was relentless in her efforts to prove her commitment. She stopped working late at night, spending more time with me instead. She shared her writing openly, inviting me into the parts of her world she'd once kept hidden. I wasn't sure if I could forgive her, but for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least now, we were walking it together. Therapy became a strange sort of ritual for us. Every week, Claire and I would drive to Dr. Hensley's office, sit on opposite ends of the couch, and try to untangle the mess we'd created. The sessions were emotionally draining, often forcing us to confront truths we'd both ignored for years. Claire opened up about her insecurities in a way I'd never seen before. She admitted to feeling invisible, like her needs and dreams had been sidelined in favor of my career. "I convinced myself that you didn't see me anymore," she said during one session, her voice thick with emotion. And instead of telling you, I found someone who did. Her words were like a punch to the gut. They didn't excuse her betrayal, but they gave me a window into her mind, a glimpse of the pain she'd been carrying. Dr. Hensley guided us through these conversations with remarkable patience, encouraging us to speak honestly without fear of judgment. I began to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, the way I'd thrown myself into work, the way we'd stopped prioritizing each other. It's not about assigning blame, Dr. Hensley said one day. It's about understanding how you got here and deciding, together, whether you want to move forward. That word, together, hung in the air, both a challenge and an opportunity. Outside of therapy, things were still tense but slightly less volatile. Claire made a noticeable effort to bridge the gap between us, small gestures that I couldn't help but notice. She'd leave notes in my lunch bag, little reminders that she was thinking of me. She started cooking dinner more often, inviting me to sit with her and talk about our day. At first, I resisted. The wounds were still fresh, and I didn't trust her intentions. But over time, her consistency began to chip away at the walls I'd built around myself. One evening, after a particularly tough therapy session, we found ourselves sitting on the couch together, the silence between us not as heavy as it had been. Claire turned to me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you think we can get through this?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, the question cutting straight to the heart of my doubts. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I'm willing to try." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That's all I can ask for." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a step. That night, as we lay in bed, the space between us seemed smaller. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe we were on the same side again. The pain wasn't gone, and the trust wasn't fully rebuilt. But for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that healing was possible. The days that followed were slow, deliberate, and filled with moments of uncertainty. Forgiveness wasn't something that could happen overnight, at least, not for me. Claire understood that, or at least she seemed to. She never pushed or rushed me, instead focusing on showing me, through actions rather than words, that she was committed to making things right. She started being more transparent, something that had been sorely lacking before. She would leave her phone out in the open, answer texts in front of me, and even offer to share her work with me, a stark contrast to the secrecy that had defined our life for months. It was strange at first, but it helped ease the tension, bit by bit. Her journal, the thing that had caused so much damage, was no longer a point of secrecy. One evening, Claire brought it to me and placed it gently on the table. "I've been writing again," she said, her voice steady but soft. "Not about him, not about what happened. Just about us. About how I feel. You can read it, if you want." At first, I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it, if I could handle revisiting everything that had torn us apart. But I could see how much it meant to her, how hard she was trying. After a long pause, I nodded. "Maybe later," I said. That moment was one of many small shifts between us, each one chipping away at the distance we'd allowed to grow. Therapy continued to play a vital role in our progress. Dr. Hensley encouraged us to create boundaries, not just for Claire, but for me, too. "Healing is a two-way street," she said during one session. "Claire needs to be consistent and transparent, but Matthew, you also need to allow room for trust to grow. That doesn't mean ignoring your feelings. It means choosing to let go of suspicion when her actions show she's trying." It wasn't easy. Some days, I felt like we were moving forward. Other days, the doubts crept back in, whispering that I was making a mistake. But then there were moments, quiet, ordinary moments, that reminded me why I was trying. One evening, as we sat at the dining table after dinner, Claire looked up from her plate and said, "I've been thinking about us lately. About the things we used to love doing together. Do you remember how we used to play board games on weekends? We haven't done that in years. I nodded, a faint smile tugging at my lips. I remember. Maybe we could start again, she said, her voice tentative. It doesn't have to be tonight, but, someday. That weekend, we dusted off an old game from the closet and sat at the table, laughing over the ridiculous rules we'd forgotten. For the first time in what felt like forever, the tension lifted. It wasn't perfect, but it was a glimpse of what we'd once had, and what we might be able to rebuild. I also began to focus on myself, something I hadn't done in years. I started running again, a hobby I'd abandoned when work and life got too busy. The steady rhythm of my feet pounding the pavement became a source of clarity, a space where I could sort through my thoughts without interruption. Claire noticed the change in me, and instead of feeling left out, she encouraged it. You look happier when you come back from your runs, she said one morning. It's nice to see. Her support felt genuine, and slowly, I started to let my guard down. Trust wasn't something that could be forced, but with each passing day, I found myself less consumed by anger and more willing to believe in the possibility of healing. The road was still long, but for the first time, I could see the faintest glimmer of light at the end of it. And that was enough to keep me moving forward. As the weeks turned into months, Claire and I found a new rhythm, one built on effort, honesty, and the willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths we'd avoided for so long. Progress wasn't linear, but we were moving forward, even if the steps were small. One thing I hadn't expected was how much I'd learn about her during this process. Over 10 years of marriage, I thought I'd known Claire inside and out. But therapy, and the work we were doing outside of it, revealed layers of her I'd never fully seen. I've always admired how focused you are, she told me one evening as we sat on the porch, sipping tea. It's one of the things that made me fall in love with you. But sometimes, I felt like I couldn't compete with that focus. Like I wasn't enough to pull you away from everything else. Her words stung, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I'd thrown myself so completely into my career that I hadn't noticed the ways it had eroded our connection. I didn't realize, I admitted, staring down at the mug in my hands. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to, providing for us, making sure we had a stable life. I didn't see how much it cost you. She reached over, her fingers brushing mine. We both made mistakes, she said gently. But we're trying now, and that means everything to me. Those moments of vulnerability brought us closer than we'd been in years. We started spending more intentional time together, rediscovering the simple things we used to enjoy. Long walks through the park, cooking dinner side by side, binge-watching old TV shows we hadn't seen in forever. It wasn't flashy, but it felt real. At the same time, I began rediscovering myself. Therapy had taught me the importance of balance, not just in our marriage, but in my own life. I dusted off my guitar, an old passion I'd abandoned years ago, and began playing again. Claire would sit in the living room, listening as I fumbled through songs I hadn't practiced in ages. You're getting better, she'd tease, a playful smile tugging at her lips. I'd roll my eyes but secretly appreciate her encouragement. Music became my outlet, a way to process the lingering emotions I couldn't always put into words. Through these small changes, I began to see her not just as the woman who had hurt me, but as someone flawed and human, someone who was trying, just like I was. One afternoon, as we were cleaning out the garage, we stumbled across a box of old photo albums. Claire pulled one out, her face lighting up as she flipped through the pages. Remember this? She asked, holding up a picture of us from our honeymoon. We were standing on a rocky beach, wind-blown and grinning like idiots. I nodded, a smile tugging at my lips despite myself. You made me climb that ridiculous hill just to get that shot. And it was worth it, she said, laughing. Look how happy we were. For a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by a flicker of hope. Maybe we could get back to that place, not exactly the same, but something close enough to feel whole again. We still had a long way to go, but with every laugh, every shared memory, and every step forward, the pieces of our relationship started to come together again. Slowly but surely, we were finding our way back to each other. Forgiveness is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive all at once or in some dramatic moment of clarity. It creeps in slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day you realize that the weight you've been carrying isn't as heavy as it used to be. That's how it happened for me. Claire and I had been working hard, both individually and together, to rebuild what we'd lost. Therapy helped us open doors that had been locked for years, forcing us to confront not only the affair but the underlying cracks in our relationship. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger surged back, unbidden and sharp, but they were becoming less frequent. One evening, after a particularly emotional therapy session, Claire and I sat on the couch, exhausted but strangely at peace. We'd spent the session talking about the future, what we wanted, what we were afraid of, and what we were willing to fight for. Claire turned to me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know I've said this before, but I need to say it again," she began. "I'm so sorry, Matthew. For everything. For hurting you, for betraying your trust, for making you question yourself. I can't take it back, but I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your forgiveness." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she looked away, as if afraid to meet my eyes. I sat in silence, her words hanging in the air. For months, I'd held on to my anger like a shield, convinced that letting it go would mean letting her off the hook. But as I looked at her now, vulnerable, remorseful, and genuinely trying, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving her. It was about freeing myself. "I don't know if I'll ever forget what happened," I said quietly, "but I'm starting to think I can forgive it." She turned to me, her expression a mix of surprise and cautious hope. "You mean that?" I nodded, the words feeling heavy but right. "Forgiveness doesn't mean everything's perfect. It just means I'm willing to try. To move forward." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it wasn't from sadness. "Thank you," she whispered. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it gave us a chance to build something new. That night, as we sat together, the distance between us felt smaller. We weren't the same people we'd been before the affair, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this version of us could be stronger, more honest, and more resilient. Forgiving Claire wasn't the end of the journey, it was the beginning of a new one. One where we both had to show up every day, ready to work, ready to heal, and ready to choose each other again. And for the first time in a long time, I believed that we could. Forgiveness was the first step, but rebuilding trust was an entirely different challenge. It wasn't just about her actions anymore, it was about the choices we made moving forward and the commitment to live differently than before. Claire understood this, and her efforts reflected it. She no longer guarded her phone or journal like they were state secrets. Instead, she made a point of being open and transparent, even when it wasn't asked of her. "Hey, I'm meeting Sarah for coffee tomorrow," she'd say casually, referring to her best friend. "Would you like to come, or should I bring something back for you?" It was such a simple gesture, but it meant the world to me. She was including me in her plans, removing the secrecy that had plagued our relationship before. We also created new habits that helped us stay connected. Every Friday night, we had a check-in, a tradition born out of therapy. It wasn't anything formal, just a chance to sit down and talk about how we were feeling, what was working, and what wasn't. "I feel like we're communicating better," I told her one evening as we sat on the couch. "But sometimes, I still get these moments of doubt. Like, what if I'm wrong to trust again?" She nodded, her expression earnest. "I understand that. And I don't expect you to trust me completely overnight. But I promise, I'm not the person I was before. I won't give you a reason to doubt me again. Her words were backed by her actions, and over time, my doubts began to fade. Claire's journal, once a source of pain, became a surprising tool for healing. She started using it to reflect on our progress, jotting down her thoughts and feelings about where we were and where we were going. One evening, she handed it to me. "I've been writing about us," she said. "You don't have to read it if you don't want to, but I'd like you to." I hesitated, the memories of what I'd found in that journal still fresh. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized this was different. These entries weren't about betrayal, they were about growth, about love, about the small victories we were achieving together. "I can see how much this means to you," I said, setting the journal down. "And it means a lot to me, too." Beyond the practical steps, we made time for each other in ways we hadn't before. We planned date nights, took weekend trips to places we'd always talked about but never visited, and found joy in the little things, like cooking together or playing board games on rainy evenings. I also continued to focus on myself, rediscovering the parts of me I'd neglected. Running became a regular routine, and my guitar playing improved enough that Claire started joking about me joining a band. Through it all, I began to feel something I hadn't in a long time: pride. Pride in the effort we were putting into our marriage, pride in the growth I was seeing in both of us, and pride in the fact that I'd chosen to forgive, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but brick by brick, day by day, we were laying a new foundation. And with each passing day, it felt a little more solid. A year later, as I sit here writing this, it's hard to believe how far we've come. The wounds of Claire's betrayal haven't disappeared completely, but they've healed enough that I no longer feel them pulling me down. Instead, they serve as reminders, not of pain, but of resilience, growth, and the power of forgiveness. Our marriage isn't the same as it was before, but that's a good thing. The cracks we once ignored have been filled with something stronger: honesty, vulnerability, and a deep understanding of what it means to choose each other every day. Claire and I have both grown in ways I never imagined. She's more open now, not just with me but with herself. Her writing has taken on a new depth, fueled by her willingness to face her fears and emotions head-on. She even published a personal essay about our journey, and while I initially hesitated about sharing something so private, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. As for me, I've rediscovered parts of myself that I'd long forgotten. Music has become a constant in my life again, and running is no longer just an escape, it's a source of joy and clarity. I've even started mentoring younger colleagues at work, something I never would have made time for before. One of the biggest changes has been how we approach our time together. We no longer take each other for granted. Weekly date nights, spontaneous weekend trips, and quiet evenings spent talking have become our new normal. It's not about grand gestures, it's about showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. There are still moments when doubts creep in, but they don't linger the way they used to. Claire has proven, time and again, that she's committed to our future. And I've learned to trust her again, not blindly, but with the understanding that trust is something we both have to nurture. Looking back, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just for her. It was for me, too. Letting go of the anger and resentment allowed me to move forward, to find peace and happiness in a relationship that felt irreparably broken. We've even started planning for the future in ways we hadn't before. There's talk of a long overdue vacation to Europe, a dream we put on hold for years. And while the idea of starting a family is still a work in progress, it no longer feels impossible. I know we'll never be perfect, but I've learned that perfection isn't the goal. It's about showing up, doing the work, and choosing love even when it's difficult. As I close this chapter of my life and look toward the next, I feel something I haven't felt in a long time: hope. Our journey hasn't been easy, and there were moments when I thought we wouldn't make it. But we did. And while the scars of the past will always be there, they no longer define us. Instead, they remind me of how far we've come, and how much further we can go. Together.